Welcome. Welcome to all of you. To state the obvious, this is the first ever Hayes reunion without Norman, and I know it affects all of us profoundly and will affect the proceedings through the day. It's also the first in the age of Trump. We need Norman more than ever, and we need each other, our energy, our ideas, our hugs, our tears. So for all those reasons, welcome to you. I have a couple of announcements. First, I would like to thank Helen Hirschkoff for the wonderful new brochure, which is a heroic effort, which Norman always did for us, but Helen has picked up that task, and you should feel free to take a copy. It's a lot of the old favorite pictures, but a lot of new ones as well. Going forward, Marty Guggenheim has been serving as the acting associate director for the last couple semesters and will continue to do so. Beginning next spring, the ambassador Robert Van Leerup, otherwise known as Bob. Is Bob here? Oh, right in front of me. Will be serving as acting co-director with Marty. I officially retired as of September from NYU Law, but I'm going to continue to work in the Hayes program. Second announcement, Vanderbilt 202 is now the Norman Dorson Seminar Room, and it has a lot of nice photos and mementos that used to be in Norman's office. It also has a collection of Norman's books, and you should feel free to go by 202 on your way from here to the program in Greenberg or in the coffee break or during the reception and help yourself to books. I'm sure there are some books that will have particular resonance, or just take books because you would like to read them because they're there to be taken. And thanks to Hayes assistant Gail Thomas for putting that together. Final announcement, our mailing list, many of you have already complained to me about the deficiencies in our mailing list, and I had a plan for fixing it up, but we're not allowed to do that. So what you need to do is to send Gail Thomas an email telling her your proper contact information, and we will incorporate it into our mailing list. And apologies that we tried last summer to make the mailing list better, but it needs some work. The main point of my getting up here is to introduce Steve Shapiro. We are so lucky to have Steve as our guest speaker. Steve's not quite a Hayes Fellow because he picked to go to Harvard. But had he come to NYU, he surely would have been a fellow and part of the wonderful class that included Judith Resnick and a number of other people. But even though he's not a former fellow, he's definitely a fellow traveler and a collaborator of the Hayes program. After graduating and clerking for a year, he worked for over a decade at the NYCLU, and then he moved over to the ACLU. For almost a quarter of a century, Steve was the legal director of the ACLU, direct supervisor of a staff that grew from a handful of people to legions of lawyers. He was of counsel, named as counsel or co-counsel in over 200 Supreme Court cases and involved in, I'm sure, hundreds of others that weren't Supreme Court cases, either because the ACLU didn't think they should be or for other reasons. For many years, Steve has come every fall to meet with the new fellows at our first meeting, and he engages with the students. He tells stories about his career. He provides us insight into the term just closed and the cases coming up in the coming term. And he's a very busy, important guy. And to come and hang out every fall with the Hayes Fellows is a gift, and we're grateful for it. When Steve retired a couple years ago, my friend Kathleen Sullivan quipped, "The ACLU without Steve Shapiro is like the Rolling Stones without Mick Jagger. Kathleen is the master of the quotable line. As a serious Rolling Stones fan, I might have put it like this. The ACLU without Steve Shapiro is like the Rolling Stones without Keith Richards, because he's every bit the musician that Jagger is, and whip smart, and a really nice guy, and that's Steve Shapiro.
So thank you very much, Sylvia. And I have to say, I did not know until this moment that you had retired from NYU Law School. And so I think we ought to begin by just taking a moment to give Sylvia a round of applause. And now that you no longer have tenure, is that true? Do you lose tenure? Now that you're in, I can correct two mistakes you made in the introduction, or one mistake and one thing I want to correct for the record. The mistake is I am not really busy or important anymore. So if any of you want to have lunch or coffee, just give me a buzz. I'm free most of the time. And secondly, I'm happy to accept the comparison to Keith Richards as well as Mick Jagger, but I do think I have aged better than Keith Richards has aged. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here. As Sylvia says, I am not a Hayes Fellow or NYU alum, but I have certainly swum in these waters for a long time, and the River of Hayes Fellows over the years has coincided with the ACLU on many, many occasions. And so I look out in this room and I see not only several generations of Hayes alums, but a whole bunch of people who I worked with at the ACLU, and some of whom are still working at the ACLU. I do want to congratulate Helen and Sylvia. I assume they are the ones responsible for having chosen this date for this event. It must have taken a prodigious feat of forecasting months ahead to pick a day on which the weather outside is as foul as the national mood. But you have succeeded in accomplishing it. Because I have so much respect for all of you and for the Hayes program and for Norman, I would have happily accepted this invitation under any circumstances. But the fact of the matter is, I increasingly wake up in a country that I no longer recognize and don't like very much. And so it's especially nice to be in a room with so many friends and colleagues, and as Sylvia said, fellow travelers. Norman's absence from this event inevitably makes this a bittersweet occasion of sorts. The Hayes program would not exist, but for Norman, it couldn't have continued all these years. But for Sylvia and Helen, Norman may have done the brochure by himself, but for those of us who knew Norman, he was also a master of delegation, and Sylvia and Helen have done yeoman's work over the years in keeping this program going. Norman was, I think probably for everybody in this room, but I'll speak only for myself. Norman was a mentor, Norman was a teacher, Norman was a career advisor, he was a friend. And on more than one occasion, he was a drinking buddy. I looked around the room and I thought, well, if Norman were here, there would have been wine on the table. But in fact, that's not true. If Norman were here, there probably would have been scotch on the table. But in any event, I think we should not let his absence go without at least some toast. My wife has told me over the years that it's bad luck to toast with water, but water is what we have, so I just want to raise a glass to Norman. Okay, Norman. And we should all go and raid his library. We may be the last group of people in America that still read books. When Norman and Sylvia first raised the idea of, or invited me to come and talk here today, I said to them, as you normally do in these circumstances, I said, well, you know, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to talk about? And they said, well, we want you to be funny, and we want you to be pithy, and we want you to be depressingly candid, while at the same time being inspirationally hopeful. And I thought, okay, sure. And then they said, and by the way, last reunion, the speakers were Ruth Ginsburg and Anna Deavere Smith. And I said, well, that reduces the pressure. But it is true that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been a role model for me, as for so many others, for many, many years, but not for the reasons you think. She's been my role model because for years I regarded her as living proof that it was possible to get another job after the ACLU. And of course, the job she got was the Supreme Court, seat on the Supreme Court. The job I got was a speaking gig at the Hayes reunion, but you know, from each according to his ability, right? Anyway, in preparation for today, I did ask Sylvia and Helen if they would send me a roster of all the Hayes Fellows over the course of the 60 years of the program. And I don't know if this is generally available to all of you. I don't know if all of you have had the opportunity to go back and look at the names of people who have participated in this program over 60 days. But it really is, I will tell you, an extraordinary list, both in terms of the sheer talent, legal talent that appears on that list, in terms of the impact that you all collectively have had on public interest law in America. Norman was a man of many legacies. He was connected to many institutions and could proudly take credit for the role that he played in building a whole series of institutions, NYU Law School among them, and the ACLU is part of that list as well. But I honestly do believe, based on conversations with Norman over the years, that there is nothing in his life that he was prouder of than the Hayes program. And the fact that all of you are here today, I think is a testimony to what he and Sylvia and Helen and many, many, many others have achieved, and that you have fulfilled in spades his expectation for what he hoped this program would be when he first established it 60 years ago. I did have another reaction when I looked at the list, because I was thinking about the list that the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation had compiled for President Trump about potential Supreme Court nominees, and I thought, wouldn't the world have been a much better place if instead President Trump had used this list to choose his Supreme Court nominations? Indeed, if any president, Republican or Democrat during our lifetime, had used this list to pick their Supreme Court nominations. But alas, that is not the world we live in. I've always regarded myself as an optimist. You know, I've often said you can't do the work that I did, that so many of us do, unless you are an optimist. But the world is not in a very good place at the moment. And it's very easy to feel depressed and to give into despair. I was just saying to Steve and Barbara Gillers that it's difficult to get up in the morning and turn on NPR. It's difficult to get up in the morning and read the New York Times. But the fact of the matter is, despair and depression are self-indulgences that we don't have the luxury to afford. And one of the things about working in an organization like the ACLU is it had a 100-year history. And one of the advantages of that 100-year history is it gives you the benefit of some historical perspective, because if you wallow too much in the day-to-day during the hard times, you can have difficulty escaping the quagmire. So I thought to myself, well, what did the world look like in 1958 when Norman began this program? And of course, it was a very different world in 1958. The Supreme Court was and always had been for its entire history an exclusive club opened only to white men. Whatever you may think about the current Supreme Court, and I suspect I know what most of you think about the current Supreme Court, but whatever you think about the current Supreme Court, there are 3 women on it, a Latina and an African American. And Justice Ginsburg may be right when she said that the right number of women for the Supreme Court is 9, but 3 is progress, and it is progress that has been made during our lifetime. In 1958, there was no constitutional right to contraception, even for married couples, let alone a constitutional right to abortion. Women were largely treated as outside the Constitution, as were students, as were prisoners, as were the mentally ill and intellectually disabled. Brown versus Board of Education had been decided 4 years before the Hayes program began, but we were still half a decade away from the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Mapp v. Ohio had not been decided. Gideon v. Wainwright had not been decided. Miranda versus Arizona had not been decided. New York Times v. Sullivan had not been decided. The Pentagon Papers were more than a decade away. It was a very different world then than it is today. And then I went back a half a decade earlier to when Norman began his legal career and the formative experience in Norman's legal career. As I'm sure all of you heard, because Norman loved to tell stories and he loved to tell the same stories. But one of his stories, which shaped his life and therefore shaped our lives, was his time as counsel on the Army McCarthy hearings, right? He grew up as a lawyer during the midst of the communist witch hunt. And if you go back even farther and think of what the world looked like when this man, Arthur Garfield Hayes, your titular ancestor, right, began to practice law in the second decade of the 20th century, there was no concept in American law at that time that the rights guaranteed to all people, in the Bill of Rights were actually judicially enforceable. They were aspirational, right? The idea that you could go to court and sue the government for violating your rights is an idea that developed after he began practicing law, in part due to the efforts of people like Arthur Garfield Hayes, not alone, but in prominent part due to his effort and those of others who worked with him. He was part of the defense team in Sacco and Vanzetti. He was part of the defense team in the Scottsboro Boys, right? He represented labor unions at a time when organizing a union was not only a crime, but it can get you shot in the streets. Right? And I say all of that not to suggest that we ought to feel complacent about where we are, but to remember the sense of possibility. We are not the first generation of civil rights and civil liberties lawyers who have faced challenging times. And the people who came before us had a harder job than we did because we get to build on the foundation that they created. There are a lot of obstacles ahead of us. You hardly need me to go through a litany of all the civil liberties challenges we face today. And there are people in this room who are far more expert than I am on particular areas of the law that are now under siege. But whether you think about immigration or racial justice or criminal justice or LGBT rights or the basic idea of a free press, or respect for the institution of truth, right? We live in a universe that was frankly unimaginable 5 years ago, probably 2.5 years ago. I announced that I was leaving the ACLU in January of 2016, the beginning of that election year. And my successor, David Cole, was chosen over the summer, and I then wound up leaving in December of 2016 after the election, before the inauguration. But I remember when David was picked to be the next legal director of the ACLU, I looked at him and said, well, your job is going to be easy. For the first time in our lives, we're going to have a progressive Supreme Court. We're going to get to go from defense to offense. Isn't this going to be fun? Good luck, enjoy it. And of course, it turned into a game of bait and switch. That's not the job he got, and that's not the country that we got. Right? And so the question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and in some ways the theme of the panels that you're going to have this afternoon, is what are progressive lawyers supposed to do now? What is a progressive lawyering supposed to look like, right? How do we give content to the idea of being part of the resistance, and what does being part of the resistance mean? And is this all about fighting back and holding ground, or is there, in fact, an affirmative program that we need to continue to fight for? And I don't pretend to know the answers to those questions, and I wouldn't pretend to suggest to you what the answers ought to be for each of you. But I did want to spend a few minutes, and I'm not going to talk too long. It's lunch. You want to have dessert. But I did want to spend a few minutes talking about the things that I have been thinking about, and I've had some more time to think about since I have left the ACLU. And the first is this. We, the world of progressive lawyering, needs to figure out a way to reconcile our commitment to liberty, which often in this context means free speech, and to equality. And that I recognize is an issue that may have particular salience to me, because I spent my career at the ACLU, and the ACLU is often on the front lines of these debates. But it's not just a debate about the ACLU. I truly worry that it's a fault line around which a progressive coalition can fracture unless we figure out our way through some of these problems. And it's a platitude that I often repeated during the course of my career, is, well, we don't get to choose between free speech and equality. We have to find a way to protect both. And of course, at some level, that's true. But it's also true that platitudes rarely solve the hard cases. And so my career at the ACLU was funny in this regard. I began as a staff lawyer at the ACLU, at the New York Civil Liberties Union in 1976. Skokie happened in 1977. So Skokie occurs 1 year after I start to work as an ACLU staff attorney, but I'm such a newbie, and I'm working at the New York State office, and Skokie is in Illinois, obviously, that I really had no involvement in the case. Other people were working on the case, not me. And then I leave the ACLU in December 2016, and Charlottesville happens in the summer of 2017. So those two events kind of bracket my ACLU career. But in a very odd way, I was not directly involved with either one. Last year, I was asked to write an essay for the Stanford Journal on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties about the set of issues, which I called Reflections on Charlottesville. And I have one NYU student sitting in the room for whom this will seem perhaps overly familiar. But I find, as with so many of the problems that I grapple with during my ACLU career, I find that the issues are getting harder for me, not getting simpler as the years go on. And in this particular case of what should we do about hate speech? Right? I began by describing the four classic justifications that Thomas Emerson kind of codified in his book, Toward a System of Free Expression, about why we have a First Amendment in the first place. And I went through each of them, as I will now do briefly, and I have to say at the end of the day, it's not that I didn't find any of them convincing or persuasive, none of them sealed the deal for me. Right? The first explanation that Emerson offers for the regime of free speech that we hold so near and dear is that it's indispensable to a free democracy. You cannot have a democracy without free speech. Democracy assumes an informed citizenry. You can't have an informed citizenry unless you have free expression. And so democracy and free speech are inextricably linked, right? I actually think that's true. But it does not follow from that, I think credibly, that democracy and hate speech are inextricably linked. We are outliers in the world. There's virtually no other industrialized society anywhere in the world that provides constitutional protection for hate speech. And it is hard to argue that they're not functioning democracies. England prohibits hate speech, it's a democracy. France prohibits hate speech, it's a democracy. Same with Germany, same with Belgium, same with Spain, same with Italy, same with Japan, right? They're all democracies. So it can't be as simple as to say we have to allow all speech, or else we will lose our democratic heritage. The second thing Emerson says is that, well, we protect free speech because free speech is essential to individual autonomy. What defines us as human beings is the ability to think on our own, to form our own beliefs, and then to express those beliefs to the wider world. That is the essence of what it means to be human. Right? And if we restrict those rights, we are infringing the very idea of humanity and individuality. And again, I think there is a lot of truth to that. But I think it's a generalization. It's overstated because there are other forms of expression that may also say something about our individual thoughts and beliefs and autonomy that are not protected under American law. We all know. Congress shall make no law doesn't mean Congress shall make no law. There are whole hosts of forms of speech and expression that are prohibited. And so the question becomes, well, why do we allow those to be prohibited, but say hate speech is somehow sacrosanct, right? And then the third explanation is that free speech is necessary to the attainment of truth, right? The way we attain truth and the way societies progress is through the clash of ideas, and out of the fight emerges, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the world moves on to a better place. Right? It's related to Dr. King's, off-quoted statement, which he borrowed from someone else, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I actually agree that that is true. But it's not true. But even if it's true in the long term, it's not true in the short term. Or it's not always true in the short term. And a lot of bad things can happen before you get to that better place at the end. And I think it's hard to look at history, whether ancient or current, and say if we simply allow bad ideas and good ideas to be freely expressed and clash with each other in the open marketplace of ideas, the good idea will always triumph. Maybe, but maybe not. Right? And then the fourth thing that Emerson says is he says, well, free speech is a safety valve. Right? It serves in two ways. One is, if you allow the bad guys to talk, then at least we know who they are. And the second is, if you allow the bad guys to talk, then they blow off steam and they don't blow up buildings. Again, I think sometimes true, but sometimes not true. And maybe once true, but no longer as clearly true in a world with social media, where the danger of allowing the open expression on hate speech on social media enables thousands of people to find each other and gather in Charlottesville, where in the past that might have been impossible to do, simply because they didn't know where each other were, and they didn't know how to find each other, and they didn't know how to organize. Right? So I sort of worked my way through all of those things, and I said, well, that's a helpful way of thinking about the problem for me, but doesn't really get me to a final answer. And then I said to myself, but at the end of the day, maybe it's 4 decades of ACLU DNA, but at the end of the day, I am still on the free speech side of this particular battle. I'm not willing to cede to the government the power to censor even hateful ideas. And I say to myself, well, why is that so? And for me, the answer really boils down to, because I don't trust the government to exercise that power wisely once it has been granted. I don't want to give Donald Trump and his administration the ability to decide which ideas are considered hateful. I am more worried that those powers will be used against the native protesters at Standing Rock than they will be used against white supremacists in Charlottesville. I get worried when I see that the FBI has opened an investigative file into black identity movements and they don't have an ongoing investigation into white supremacist movements. I say, do you really want to empower these people to decide what speech is tolerable and what speech is intolerable? And my answer to that question still winds up being no. But I don't find the slippery slope a particularly comfortable place to be. It seems like you should have a better reason than that. And I've told this story many times, but when I went on my first date with my wife, which was in 1978, we got into a fight about Skokie. I know this is going to make me sound incredibly nerdy, but yes, and it was her fault, she started it. But we got into a fight about Skokie. And I was making this argument, you don't want the Nazis to march in Skokie, but what happens when they turn around and say that the socialists can't march in Skokie? Then you're going to be screaming or yelling, and how are you going to draw the line then? And why do you think it's going to be the Nazis as opposed to the socialists who are going to suffer under this program? And this argument went on for, I would say, conservatively 10 or 15 years. And then finally, I remember this. We were sitting at the dinner table one day, and she looked at me and said, why is it only lawyers can't tell the difference between Nazis and everybody else, right? The whole rest of the world say the Nazis are over here, everybody else is over here, and we could draw that line and the world won't fall apart, right? And, there's truth to that, right? Law school education expands our minds and closes our minds, right, in different ways. And I was reminded of this quote. I always like this quote. I don't know why, but it's a Justice Jackson quote, and I can't tell you from where it comes. But Justice Jackson said, "I, for one, do not believe that the slippery slope is without a constitutional toehold." And so I have been looking for this constitutional toehold. I haven't yet found it, but I think we need to find it. If we're going to have an honest discussion in this country about race, and I think we on the left sort of ignore that discussion at our peril. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about. I also think that we need to find a way to reintroduce the idea of economic justice into our constitutional discourse. Sylvia didn't say this, but Helen and I overlapped for 6 years at the ACLU. We were associate legal directors together from 1987 to 1993. And I can't say I spent the entire 25 years since Helen, but I've spent more time than you would think thinking to myself, I should have really have listened to Helen. Because Helen was the canary in the coal mine that was sounding this alarm a long time ago. And it's impossible to identify a single cause for the rise of authoritarianism, whether it's in this country or around the world, but surely one of the major contributing factors is the severe and growing economic inequality. And that inequality is real. There are people in this country, and there are significant numbers of people in this country who have been left behind. Why they turn to Donald Trump for salvation is a mystery to me, but their sense that the current system is not working for them is totally understandable to me and palpable. And obviously, there has been a lot of work done in the progressive legal community around issues of economic justice. I know it's going to be part of the next panel after we're done with lunch today. And there have been legal services lawyers who have been out there for decades, right, trying to protect the rights of poor people. They've been forced in recent years to try to do it on a retail basis as opposed to a wholesale basis, in part because of restrictions that Congress has placed on legal services lawyers and their ability to take on class action litigation, among other things. But really, since the days of Frank Michelman, at least as far as I know it, there has not been a lot of talk about creating a systemic constitutional understanding that would embrace class as well as other things. And so what we have done as a country, and what we certainly did at the ACLU, is we tend to try to approach those issues obliquely. And put it in language in which we feel more comfortable and in which the courts have become more comfortable, and that is for often to turn economic justice issues into race issues. And it's not a hard thing to do because there is such a corollary between racial inequality in this country and economic inequality, right? But they are not the same thing. They overlap, but they are also distinct. And I am convinced that we will not get out of the current quandary in which we now find ourselves unless we take on the issues of class and economic inequality more directly and more honestly than we as a country and we as a legal profession have done so far. I have been encouraged by the fact that there are now movements underway, for example, to try to reconsider the Supreme Court's decision in San Antonio versus Rodriguez, which said there is no fundamental right to education and poverty is not a suspect classification. And there are some very smart lawyers out there who are trying to think of ways to relitigate those issues. Maybe that's a way back into that discussion, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have. The third thing is in a world with an increasingly short attention span, we need to have a long-term vision, and we need to be patient. Because things are not going to get better in the short run, and things are certainly not going to get better in the courts in the short run. The Supreme Court we have is the Supreme Court we're likely to have for the foreseeable future. And it's not just the Supreme Court. I heard on the radio the other day that in the final 2 years of the Obama administration, the Senate confirmed 2 courts of appeals appointments. In the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the Congress has confirmed 26 appointments to the courts of appeals, and that Donald Trump has now appointed 1/6 of all active circuit court judges in the United States, right? And that number is only going to go up over the next 2 years. So these are not battles that are going to be won in the next 2 weeks. Whatever happens in the midterm elections, they're not battles that are going to be won in the next 2 years. What I don't think is true is there was an article by Linda Greenhouse in the New York Times that the other day that some of you may have read, and she talks about how the conservatives had a long-range game plan and were willing to stay the course to capture the Supreme Court. That began 31 years ago when Robert Bork was rejected as a Supreme Court nominee by the United States Senate. And the suggestion was conservatives play the long game and progressives play the short game. And I don't think that's right. You know, if you read Simple Justice, Thurgood Marshall played a pretty long game in getting to Brown versus Board of Education. Ruth Ginsburg, if she were here today, played a pretty long and slow and incremental game to get to the position we are now in, where women's rights are at least recognized under the United States Constitution. And certainly those people who have been fighting for LGBT equality would not say that their victories came overnight. They came after a very long period of time through a carefully thought out strategy and decades, if not centuries, of oppression. So progressives know what it means to wait, to take our partial victories where we can get them, to be strategic and to be tactical, but we're going to have to remember those lessons because there are going to be a lot of losses along the way, certainly in the courts, right? And we can't allow ourselves to allow those losses when they come to make us lose heart and lose faith, right? Which gets me to my fourth and last point, and that is I spend my life as a litigator. It's what I did. But I think that Barack Obama may have been right when he said that progressives over-relied on the courts. I always resisted that at the time. I thought you take your victories where you can get them, and I still, I guess, believe that. If opportunities exist in court, we ought to take them. But a lot of this battle is inescapably political. And human rights has always been political. Litigation is never more than one tactic, right? To advance what is ultimately a political goal of equal rights and equal dignity for all people. And I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is there is much to be encouraged by some of the resistance, some of the backlash that we have seen over the last year or two. We were just talking at our table about how students at NYU and elsewhere are responding to the current environment. And I think the consensus is that students, or at least the students that take our classes, right, are energized, right? They want to get out there and fight. But there is also a difference between hashtag activism and institution building. And in the long run, if we're going to change the world, we're going to have to create institutions that allow us to change the world. And that's one of the lessons I think we can learn from Norman, because Norman was nothing if not an institution builder. And so I used to often end my talks at the ACLU by quoting Roger Baldwin, who is one of the founders of the ACLU back in 1920, and he was still around when I first joined the ACLU in 1976. And I heard him speak several times. He was an incredible public speaker, and he used to say, at least in every speech I ever heard him deliver, he quoted this line from Robert Louis Stevenson. He would say, "It is better to travel hopefully than to arrive." And then he would say in this great raspy voice, he would say, "At the age of 90, I am still traveling hopefully," right? I know I'm supposed to be sort of upbeat and inspirational. I have to tell you, I'm not traveling very hopefully at the moment. Right? But what I'm not prepared to do is to give up. What I'm not prepared to do is to stop fighting. And one of the things that sustains all of us, I think, in that effort, is to know that this room and many other rooms like this are filled with people who I am confident are not planning to give up and are not planning to fight. And one of the great things about the Hayes program is being able to look down that list and look across this room and see generations of people and know, in fact, that the torch can be passed and the torch is being passed. And so I just want to say, in closing, that I intend to continue to do what I can. I will do my utmost to have your back and to thank you all for what you do, and to thank you all for being here today. I can't end by not talking about my grandchildren, right? I have 2 young grandchildren, 17 months old. In fact, you're very lucky because this entire speech was originally just going to be a PowerPoint of baby pictures. But I was talked out of that. I want those kids to grow up in a world that I'm proud of, right? And that's on you. You know, and that's on all of us. And so I think we need to learn from each other. I think we need to lean on each other. I think we need to stay together. I think we need to never forget that our values are the right values. I do believe that history is on our side, but history is not linear. It is 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and we are taking a step back at the moment. But at some point that will change, right? And we are only going to be able to take advantage of that if we do the hard work that needs to be done to prepare for that moment. And in the meantime, we need to keep our fingers in the dike. So let's go out there and do everything we can. And let's collectively try to make this a world that would fulfill the vision that Norman had when he started this program 60 years ago. So thank you all very, very much. So I find this very, very hard to believe, and I promise not to be insulted, but I think I was told I should take questions for 10 minutes if there are questions. So I'm happy to do that. We can start with last night's World Series game, but we can talk about anything, any questions anybody may have. What? Tomorrow's Jet game, right. I'm a Giants fan, I'm sorry. All right, well, I don't, this is like a Quaker wedding. Oh no, Helen, you don't get to ask questions. Your questions are too hard, Helen. You don't get to ask questions.
Years move. Now, Steve might not have known that Sylvia has retired and become Professor Emerita. But this is something that I have had to live with for months and even years. Now, she has promised me in the privacy of conversations in her neat office that she will stay with the program, at least in the fall when she's not in Hawaii. But I want her to say this in front of all of you, okay? I want witnesses, I want it recorded, I want a photo. Okay, Sylvia, say it. Say it. Okay, all right. All right. Brava. Okay, yes. Okay, now in planning today's reunion, I promised Sylvia that I would not make the reunion all about her. Now, I'm a lawyer. It's not all about her. It's a little bit about her. It's a lot about her. How can you celebrate the Hayes program and think about the challenges ahead without thinking about Sylvia? and of course Norman as well. And sometimes I feel I'm clearly not the last person standing. There's Marty, there's Bob, I mean, there's all of you. But I will say sometimes in this grim world, I think that I am the luckiest person in the world. First, I worked with Steve at the ACLU, even though he didn't listen to me and really didn't recognize economic inequality. It was just like, how did anyone have this blind spot? And I then came to the ACLU, I then came to NYU, and I worked with Norman and Sylvia, and although I don't actually know many of the fellows who came before my time at NYU, except say for Liz, who I'm now co-authoring an article with, and it's a great pleasure. I do know the younger fellows, and I will say you give my life energy and inspiration and meaning every single day.